You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about exciting, creative, and innovative ways of living. Produced in Santa Barbara, California, Sustainable World focuses on positive solutions to environmental challenges, solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics, earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe, how to plant a food forest, restorative design, or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned to Sustainable World Radio. I'm Jill Cloutier. Rebecca Burgess, welcome back to Sustainable World Radio. And our topic today is natural dyeing, and you are an expert in that. And I've been looking at your book, Harvesting Color, and it's a beautiful book filled with lovely pictures of plants and of you using natural dyes. So let's get started at the beginning for you. When did you first become interested in natural dyeing?
It started with actually teaching children textile arts, and I was 19 and I got a job that was a little bit over my head. I was all of a sudden in charge of a program for textile arts for young people at UC Davis's Arts and Crafts Center, and I had to teach them how to use surface design techniques, and a lot of what I had to use were acid dyes, fiber reactive dyes, pretty much the store-bought synthetic dyes that you would use for tie-dyeing, that you would use for silk painting. I was teaching them how to use them, and I kept wondering, and I wasn't sure if they were wondering this, but and as a formative 9-year-old experience, to just be using red and blue and yellow and green without really understanding where the color came from. We were just applying color onto silk or onto our t-shirts, and it just felt like we were getting this instant gratification, but at the same time, the art form itself seemed like we felt like we were getting gypped of something. Like we were just throwing color onto this fabric and it was adhering to it, and there was no depth to the process for me. And I thought, wow, I'm kind of responsible for the psyches of these young formative minds, and I've got to do something a little bit more what I would say rootsy, which is connect them to the source of all these raw materials they're working with. And so we started doing natural dye experiments with cabbage and beets and turmeric, things like, at that point it was Ask Jeeves. You could go online and find certain recipes, and I explored very simple kitchen-based recipes, and the kids freaked out. They could squirt fiber reactive dye onto cotton t-shirts for 10 minutes and get bored, but you start cooking natural dyes on a stove and put a little stool there so they can stand up there and look at what's going on in the pot and watch how long it takes the color to adhere to the fiber, pulling it out and seeing if it's the right color, seeing what happens if you soak it overnight, seeing what happens if you soak it for 5 minutes, chopping up the plants, collecting the plants, eating some of them while you're putting them in the pot. I mean, smashing blackberries into your t-shirt when it's done as another way to, dye it. It was a very enriching sensory experience versus the synthetic dyes where everyone had to wear gloves and I was wearing a mask, and I was like, what are we doing? We can't. So the difference is you could eat it, smell it, touch it with your raw hands, or you wear latex gloves and a mask that you then throw away in the garbage when you're done with the tie-dye experience. So the contrast was so viscerally clear to me, and the children liked the natural dyes so much that from that point on, I just I took an inventory of that experience and chronicled it and started moving forward with more lesson plans around the source of color. And really what I've developed over the last 10 years, 12 years now is what I call the ecology of color. Those were my roots. That was the beginning. It was really about kids and their interest and trying to do something responsible for them.
And you've really then bridged the gap between, I know you're an environmental educator, between ecology, education, and bringing in art and creativity as well.
Yes, definitely. It's a very important thing for me to bridge the craft or the art of, that we enable ourselves all the time with using colors from wherever and making and self-expressing. So there's a craft and an art to self-expression that includes a lot of use of color. But for my love of the environment, I had to build a bridge between self-expression and ecology. And natural dyes have been that bridge for me and a bridge for a lot of others that I've ended up teaching. Teaching was a little bit of a default zone. In some ways, I just assumed I didn't, as a young person, I didn't realize the power of education. I was a student, but I'd never taken the role of teacher. And as you start taking the role of teacher, um, it's a whole world in itself. So I would say there's three worlds, and one is color, and one is the environment, and the other is education. And I'm weaving those together, but they stand alone very, I would say, very stoically.
Well, speaking of weaving, you've actually been doing a lot of work as well with the idea of fiber sheds. And if you could, we might be using that term a bit for those who didn't hear a previous interview in this go round. Could you tell listeners what that term means and maybe how you envision us living from and within our fiber sheds?
Well, the fiber shed term, just for those who haven't heard it before, it's a term that I made up that I was utilizing after I'd learned a lot about watersheds and food sheds. I started to think, well, what are the basic human necessities? And I think of that as water, I think of it as food, and I think of shelter. And your first form of shelter is your clothing. And that means to me that there's a responsibility we have to understanding deeply where that shelter comes from, where those clothes come from, and those textiles. And there was a pretty large gap for me in what I was wearing and the geographical landscape from which it derived. So I used the word fiber shed to start forming what I call a thought threshold. Once you start walking through the idea of fiber shed in your mind conceptually, you start asking questions. And once you start asking questions, you don't really get them answered very quickly. Fiber sheds to me were very elusive when I first started, and they're becoming more well defined. It's like kind of like drawing blind. I didn't really know how this was going to work, but I started finding wool, and I started finding cotton, and I started finding sheep and the people who raised them and the people who grew the cotton, and I found designers who were very interested in working with these local materials. And the more I connected to the biological context of my clothes, I realized how much responsibility we don't take in general for what's put on those fibers or how those animals are treated or who's raising them and how those materials are shipped around the world and how the color is put on those fibers. And the more I investigated my own fiber shed and dressed from my own fiber shed for 1 year, underwear, swimsuit, everything included, I've learned to appreciate garments in a way that is, I would say, beyond what I could have ever expected. It's hard for me to put it in words because it's an ever evolving process, and it's very sensory oriented. It's the feeling of wool on my skin and such. So
I could see how really from what you were describing, where you're with the natural dye process with the children, where you're collecting the plants and watching them cook and boil, and then you're eating them along the way and using nature and using plants in such a way that it's creating these wonderful colors as opposed to a lot of the chemical dyes. It's such a non-sensual experience. So I can imagine wearing these clothes that are so lovingly produced would really make a difference. And you can actually probably feel that energy in the clothes.
oh, completely. And it's so interesting because they don't actually, some of them obviously, these are prototypes. They don't fit the way you would think your favorite pair of stretchy yoga pants and your plastic fleece jacket. I mean, I think most of people in Northern California, I think, live in those items, that performance wear. And um, I was very used to living like that too, because you could wear those clothes anywhere. They're socially acceptable. They are they move well, and so my fiber shed clothes, I would say, in some cases, don't have the same ease, but they compensate for that with such an incredible, like you're saying, this feeling of wholeness and connectivity that I can connect the sheep. I literally see the faces of the sheep when I look down at the sweater I'm wearing right now. And they're Jacob's sheep, and they were raised by Robin Lind in Solano County, and I know the pastures that they graze. And I'm looking down at my socks, and they're alpaca, and they've been darned, which means repaired, so many times. They look like a patchwork of beautiful shades of brown, white, and like ochre. And it's like this amazing sock that is just patched together because I've been wearing them for a year, and I went backpacking in these socks. And I know the alpaca that grew this fiber, and I know their owners, Julie and Ken Rosenfeld. So it is a very different reality to be connected with people, plants, and animals intimately, and to wear them on your skin. It's extremely powerful and new for the modern world.
Well, the story, so really our clothes do have a story. And if we trace that story back, many of us would probably be shocked. We wouldn't be tracing it back to our sheep, our friend's sheep. It would be more the polyester, the coal tar. No.
It would be, yeah, it would be, if you wanted to trace the story back, let's say you wanted to make your own Lululemon pants, you would probably dig a hole in the ground, I don't know, 400, 500 feet, 2 miles down, 5 miles down. I don't know how far they're extracting coal tar from now. You'd have to find a special spot on the planet. You'd have to secure ownership rights. You'd have to pump coal tar oil. You'd have to find these fossil fuel, what we call, well, I guess they're called fossil fuels, but coal tar was, in particular, what was used for synthetic dye creation. But all of the microfibers used for stretch clothing are also petroleum based. So I always ask kids, like, so, what would you like to do today? We could dig a 2 mile hole down and extract petroleum and refine it in a big refinery and then pull out these particulates that then we infuse with heavy metals. That's what we could do today in our dye class. Or we could go out and plant some plants and harvest some and boil some water and make some colors. And the kids are like, I don't think we have time to dig a big hole like that. And I think that would kind of mess up the farm that we're on. I don't know. I think we're going to end up doing the planting. You just put it in these really simple terms, like, what would you do in your own backyard? Would you drill for oil in your own backyard? Probably not.
I love that. That's wonderful. That's really a clear-cut way to look at it. However, Rebecca, one thing I do have to say is we know, many billions of people on the planet. Do you foresee a time when we are living in our fiber sheds? Is that possible with so many people here and such demand for clothing?
The more it's when I first started without any actual functional awareness of a fiber shed or my own fiber shed. I would say just when I was on the precipice of the concept, I thought to myself, no, 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 no way no way are people in the Bay Area going to be clothed by this. Well, where I was I was in my head. And the more, I have to say, the more I've gone down the path, the more I've talked to the cotton farmers and the non-GMO cotton farmers, the organic cotton farmers, the more I talk to them, they actually aren't even selling all the cotton that they're growing. There's actually 22,000 pounds of wool not being used in my county every year. It's getting thrown away. So what I'm noticing is there's actually all of these fibers that are in my fiber shed that aren't being used at all. And I think if we looked at every community, yes, some communities are going to need to import textiles. That's always been the case. But some of the more abundant communities that can farm, that can raise the animals, I think that if they were efficient with their resources, like my fiber shed, if it was more efficient in its use of its organic cotton and wool, we could easily clothe. I would say I'm starting to see, like, our first year, we're starting a Grow Your Jeans project. We'll be clothing 500 to 1,000 people in just of one little dinky project, just an experimental project we're starting this year. And I thought, oh, that's nothing. That's like a couple of acres of cotton. So what I'm seeing is that I don't have an answer completely to say yes or no. But what I can say is that on the journey towards clothing myself and more people, I'm realizing that it's actually more possible than I thought before. So I think that's a good sign. And I just don't like to make vast assumptions about whether everyone could be dressed this way. I think that's where we get into actually really unsafe territory when we generalize that way, because If I had started that way, I would have never jumped into fiber shed. I would have just been caught off guard by the idealism of it.
The enormity of it.
Right, right. So if you get caught there, you have to step back and say, well, let's just try it anyway, because we're in an ecological crisis. We have to find different ways of feeding and clothing and, creating our communities. All of this has to change. So why not just experiment with the people in my community who aren't even selling the fibers that they're growing? Let's just start with utilizing what is and then see what happens. And I'm still on the verge of, discovering what that means. And we started a marketplace. So we're actually starting to sell those raw materials. So they are available.
Let's talk a bit about some of your favorite dye plants and also the process of how you go about dyeing natural fabrics.
Well, what I'm working on this morning is a Toyon recipe. It's Heteromeles arbutifolia, and it's a plant species that's native to California, Southern Oregon. It is a red berry producing plant in the winter. And it's native to the California chaparral. So you see it growing with sagebrush and coyote brush and coffee berry, and it's tall. It'll grow, it can grow shrub-like or like a small tree. And this time of year, it's very identifiable. It's in the winter section of my book because the red berries, like I said, are being produced, and migratory songbirds are dependent on that as a food source. So it's a very integral part of the California, Southern Oregon landscape. At the same time, I'm working with it this morning. I'm cooking it in an old copper pot that was hand constructed in 1840, and it's the most beautiful copper pot, and I fill it with toyon branches, and primarily I don't use the berries at all, even though they're producing red. That's not where the pigment is. The pigment is kind of dormant when you first see the plant, and it's within the stems. And so you can harvest it. You can harvest the suckers from the base of the plant. And I put it in the copper pot, and then I cook it. And the copper patinas the color, and it becomes beautiful shades of deep orange.
Ah, that sounds gorgeous.
Yeah, with reds in it. It's a very unique color that just blows my mind. If you don't cook it in copper, you get a color of orange that looks like a very pale inside of, a navel orange, that kind of like typical orange. But if you cook it in copper, you pull the reds out and you get more like a blood orange color. So that's one of my favorite plants, and I'm loving it because I harvested it this morning. I'm working with it today. I'm preparing to do a book talk on Toyon on Sunday. So I'm very immersed in the species at the moment.
They grow around all over California. We have them down here as well.
They're wonderful. So in terms of, I guess that would be one of my favorite winter species. Japanese indigo is another one of my favorite plant species, and it's a native to Japan, and it grows incredibly well in North America, and it's the most beautiful source of blue. I grew 4,000 Japanese indigo plants this year, and you process it like tea, and you dry the leaf out in the sun and the stems, and then you stomp it, and you collect all the dried leaf and compost the stems. And then I'm going to be composting, or I would say fermenting, the leaf matter for 100 days this winter. And then in the spring, I'll be putting this fermented leaf matter into big vats that I keep at 80 degrees or so. Excuse me. And then I'm going to move the vats out into hopefully a greenhouse where I can keep them warm passively. And then I'll be dyeing yarn for this Grow Your Jeans project, as well as making yarns for other people's small artisanal weaving projects. And we're going to do a dye kit for kids too.
The Japanese indigo, do you know the Latin name of that plant?
It's Polygonum tinctorium or Polygonum tinctorium. People pronounce it different ways, but it's in the buckwheat family. And it is an annual, whereas Toyon was a perennial. So you plant it every year. The seeds have to be used fresh, so you have to harvest your seeds and plant again in the spring. It'll grow. You plant it after the last frost in this area. That's April. You plant it by starts generally, and then you harvest all through the summer, and then it's pretty much done by the time the first frost comes around.
We have Japanese indigo. We have the Toyon. What's another dye plant that you have a relationship with?
Oh, I have a deep relationship with Coreopsis Sanctorium this year. It is, I would say, I've described a California native, an internationally renowned source of blue, Japanese indigo, and then there's the Coreopsis, which again, it has international renown as well. You can tell because of its species name, Tinctoria or Tinctorium. It's a dye plant. All dye plants have the tint or the tink, like Polygonum tinctorium or Rubia tinctorium or Coreopsis tinctorium. So you know just by its name that it's been used throughout time and history. And I love it because it's the easiest of all the dyes to process. So it's a perennial in this area. In some areas, it'll completely die back, I think in the colder zones. But I can cut it back to the base and it'll regrow in the spring. It grows about 4 feet high and it's covered in these little orange and red flowers that look like the sun. They're just the most beautiful little emblems of the sun. And that's actually the color that they yield when you put them in a jar and you cover the jar with water and then you put the jar in the sun. The sun cooks the color. The petals are so lightweight and so genteel that the sun can cook the color out of them. You don't need to cook them on a stovetop.
That's great. So you're using solar energy to actually pull out the dye.
Exactly. And so I've made dye kits for children. They'll be up, actually today is the first day. I've been waiting 5 months to launch these little dye kits for kids, and we're putting them on the Fiber Shed Marketplace today. And we've made a little knitwear pattern so that the children can, the whole project is just to give children like a jar the jar is how you ship the thing, but it's also your dye vessel. And so no plastic, they get this jar and they put water on the flowers and then their yarn is there and then they dye the yarn and then they can knit a little squid. We have a knitwear pattern for a little squid. He's called Sid the squid. They're super cute and it's a great way to teach children about that, regenerative color. So
I love that. Do most dyes, natural dyes, are they mostly plant derived or are some from minerals or
um all the plants that all the species that I'm working with, of course, I'm always using plant-based colors, but a lot of natural dyes are clay. They're minerals. Traditionally, Paleolithic era, traditionally, people were painting on animal skins with clay. And if you follow that clay dyeing thread through time and anthropological history, people currently dye clothes in clay all over the world. And there's mud cloths in Africa that are very beautiful. They're woven and then painted on with mud. And clay, because of the, especially in the Southwest, there's so many beautiful clay strips that are, iron oxides and ochre colored clay particulate that you can get, yellows and reds and even subtle forms of green I've seen in clay and silvers and black. There's a lot to be offered through that. And clay is very fun also for children to paint with. You can mix a little bit of clay powder with soy milk, or traditionally they would mix it with any kind of protein like blood, or I'm trying to think, any nut milk as well. And then you can paint on fabric with clay. It's amazing. It's super easy. So I didn't highlight that in the book, but it's certainly, I use it all the time with children. We dye our fabric and then we take it out of the dye vat and then we paint on top of that with clay. It's really enjoyable.
very interesting. Many years ago, I was doing an environmental education class with kids, and I was looking up, I guess it was integrated pest management or something about insects, and I came across a dye from scale insects that live on prickly pear cactus.
Oh my gosh.
Does that does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah. Cochineal.
Oh, so cochineal, could you tell? I thought that was so fascinating how they actually, from what I read was many, many years ago, they would have plantations of these plants and actually harvest the insect to make the red dye. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, cochineal is a little insect, and it does grow on the prickly pear cactus, the Apuntia cactus. And I did put that recipe in the book. It is my one non-plant-based recipe. that I put in there because it's just so beautiful. I mean, the color is like magenta pink, and it's so color and light fast that I couldn't help but put it in the winter section because it makes such a beautiful winter color. So the little insects are growing on the cactus, and what they'll do is collect the mother, I believe, after her eggs have been laid. It's really incredible. And she will have died at that point, so they're collecting her carcass.
And then do they just put it into water, or what do they do with the mother's body?
Well, the mother's body is then collected in mass. You need quite a few to. It's not the most, I would say, if we were talking about clothing the global population, we probably wouldn't all be wearing a lot of magenta because it does take quite a few of the carcasses. The little female bodies are collected. I think you need about a 1-to-1 ratio. It might be less. I mean, you could probably do lighter colors, but you need 1 pound of carcass to 1 pound of fiber to really get an extremely strong color. And what they do is you put them all in a little tea bag and you put it in water, and you could grind them. Primarily, if I don't use it now because I'm immersed in this fiber shed project and I can't get cochineal locally, but what I would do when I used to work with it a lot is I would grind it in a coffee grinder, all the little carcasses, and then I'd make a fine powder out of that, and then I'd put that in a tea bag. And then there was a lot more surface area for the water to penetrate all the little pigment particles. And it was so beautiful to see this, little tea bag floating in bright pink water. And then the colors coming out of that. It's very pH sensitive. So if you take it out and it's magenta and you want to make it more purple, you'd put it into a bath of wood ash water or something very alkaline, and it would turn purple immediately. Or if you wanted it really bright pink, you'd put it into a bath of water and vinegar, and then it would turn really bright pink. So it's sensitive to alkalinity, and you can create all these variations from one little tea bag of dye.
You remarked that it was 1 pound of the insect per pound of fiber, and those insects are very light. So that's probably a very energy intensive and time intensive process, I would think.
It is. People always say, deeply appreciate that cochineal because that took a lot. And I think I put a little lighter weight ratio in the book. I believe that I wasn't expecting people to use a 1-to-1, but when you see the really dry, like stark, amazing colors, I would say they probably are using a 1-to-1 ratio. So I just say, if you're going to wear that color, just know how sacred a process that is. All those little insects eating all that pigment in that plant, and then all of them dying and then being collected. It's the people who harvest. They have to harvest those little tiny insects by hand. So it's like picking my Coreopsis flowers. I pick them all by hand. Anything done by hand like that takes a long time.
Going back in history, purple was always the royal color, at least in Europe. And do you know what was used? Why was purple so valuable and so rare at that time? What plant was used to make purple?
Well, they eventually found a plant, but in the Roman era, they were using a mollusk, a little sea creature from the Mediterranean, whose Latin name is not with me, Murex something or other. But I need to investigate its Latin name. But anyway, they harvested the mollusk out of the med and made purple from its ink. So they'd squeeze it, and you would need some ungodly amount, like 1,400 mollusks, to make a few grams of purple dye. It was amazing because they're tiny and they squirt out just a little bit, and all the mollusks, of course, would lose their life. It wasn't quite like cochineal where the mother is she leaves her body behind for your harvesting. But with the mollusk, you'd have to harvest it live, and it was it was for royalty, I think, due to the intensity of harvesting that color. And eventually they found logwood in the Bay of Campeche, and in Mexico, the Dominican Republic. All of the more warmer climate areas grow the logwood tree. It can be a shrub tree. And when the Europeans found logwood, which is an incredible source of purple and lavender and black dye, they soon started harvesting logwood in mass. But until then, it was all about the mollusk in Europe.
Well, that brings me to one question I had was the etiquette of harvesting is how you say it in your book. And how do you ensure that we don't over harvest? And how do you make sure that you don't make your favorite dye plant disappear?
Well, one of the things is my approach is has really my approach to dye harvesting takes on a modern use land, I would say land appreciation, land understanding, where is I'm using plants that, for instance, if I'm using a native plant, most of the native plants that I use in California, I would say actually all of them, coyote brush, sagebrush, sticky monkey, um, elder, toyon coffeeberry, all of those, a lot of those species will grow in a way that they, at a certain time of year, they would have naturally every 2 to 5 years probably experienced a burn, a natural fire. And so what I've done is I've made recipes out of plants that have co-evolved with fire. So what I try to do, and they've also co-evolved with herbivory. So what I try to do is mimic forces of nature. So etiquette is really about if you're coming into a landscape that's yours, or you have permission. That's the first thing you ask a landowner. I have access to a lot of ranch land in this area, and a lot of that ranch land also needs restoration. So you can offer, if you don't have land yourself, you can offer to house a native garden on someone's land because it increases habitat on their land and it increases water absorption in their soils. And it can also mitigate erosion. So I've done these things where I've mimicked natural processes. I've gone out and restored areas that I want harvesting rights to, and I always ask permission. And I work with plants that are in great abundance. I don't work with any plant that has any kind of threatened status ever. There's none of those plants in the book. So again, I'm working with what I would call nature's abundance. And I'm also, if everyone were to start, the question around everyone doing anything is always a funny question because you can't get everyone to do anything. I always think, well, if you're afraid of everyone's going to harvest coyote brush, man, I'd be happy if we could get a tenth of the population even wearing natural dyes. Like, I don't, we are so, it's like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because you're afraid everyone's going to start doing something. Like, let's just start with a little bit of engagement with the process before we throw it away. So, coyote brush, for instance, is it's a beautiful shade of yellow. And the etiquette of that is if I go into a zone where there's, 10 coyote brush plants, I might, what I call coppice one of them, which means cut it down from the base. And when you cut it down from the base, it thrives. The next year, it's got all this new growth and it's so happy because you pruned it back because it's used to getting fire through its base and actually being coppiced naturally by systems of fire. So when I look at that ratio, it's like, oh, I only took 1 out of 10. So the ratio that the Native American communities that I've worked with say is you take 10%. You take 10% of an overall population, and you have to ensure that there's no repeat harvests in that area. So if you have a harvesting area, they call that usufruct in Native American and indigenous cultures around the world. Those are your areas to harvest from, and you don't have other people coming in without your knowledge and harvesting from them, because otherwise you've messed up your 10% ratio. So you really look to, this is really about gardening your own plants, creating native restoration sites at schools, going to lands that are unused and underappreciated and planting native species there. And when you reinvent a place with these native plants, then you can then feel like you have the right to harvest from them. But just going out and just harvesting from wherever, whenever, that certainly will not work. And I don't have any recommendations for doing that.
That's good. And that's really important, I think, too, is to start thinking in ways of mimicking nature and that these plants would have that disturbance. So to do it in a way that will help them thrive as well.
Yeah, we call that a beneficial disturbance. Nature is full of them.
So, Rebecca, what would be if someone's listening and they want to do an experiment and try to dye some fibers themselves? Can you give them a brief idea of what the process is?
Well, if you've got some yarn or you've got a t-shirt or something, that you're thinking needs refurbishing and you want to dye it in a natural plant material, a lot of the plants, not all of them, but many of them, like for instance, I'm trying to think of one I have mentioned, Coreopsis. Coreopsis flowers need something called a mordant. And a mordant is, I call it a real estate agent or a translator. It's a broker. This mordant is brokering a deal between your yarn and the pigment in the plant. The pigment itself is not going to bond to your t-shirt. It needs a middleman. It needs somebody to bond the pigment to the fiber. So what actually happens is if you have these recipes in the book for how to mordant your materials, and mordanting is normally done with a metal ion. And so I use very ecological forms of mordants. I don't use the mordants that have been condemned by, well, of course, the synthetic dye industry totally comes out against natural dyers because they're using metal ions. The only thing is synthetic dyes use metal ions and they're built into the powder. So you don't even see them, but they're there. But in natural dyeing, the process of dyeing is very transparent. So I can't infuse my plants with a metal ion. I have to isolate the metal ion and I have to dip my t-shirt or my yarn into a metal ion, which is basically a water bath filled with something called alum or a water bath filled with iron. Now, iron, for instance, could be achieved by putting rusty objects, and I have a recipe for this in the book. You could put rusty nails and screws in a jar and fill it with water. Put a little vinegar in there to chelate the iron off of the iron materials. Put it in the sun, and you will create iron water. And that iron water can then be poured into a bigger vat, add more water, and stick your yarn in there, and the iron will bond to your t-shirt or your yarn. And then you can take that iron bonded fiber or t-shirt or whatever it is and put it into Coreopsis flowers, or you could put it into goldenrod, or you could put it into a coffee berry plant. So I I would just recommend that you can make your own mordants, like I just said with iron. But if you use a mineral salt like alum, you generally have to buy that, and that's potassium aluminum sulfate is its scientific name. It's very benign in terms of its wastewater, and I recommend people use alum or iron primarily. And if they want to get really experimental, they can go out and use ocean water. And ocean water has metal ions in it. So if you live near the ocean, you can harvest ocean water, pour it into a big vat, and heat up your fibers and heat them up in the ocean water. And that's a mordant too. And a mordant is just what we call a binding agent. And mordant, I think, means to bite.
So it kind of bites the fabric, makes it available for the dye to stick.
Exactly. And otherwise your dyes will pretty much, they'll wash away. So you do need something. But in the case of black walnut dye or Japanese indigo, or I use oat galls. I'm trying to think of some other plant species that don't need mordants. Pokeberry does not need a mordant. Japanese indigo. Yeah, there's a huge section of species that have mordants built into them. And those are tannic acids and oxalic acids. And those compounds function like a metal ion would. And they actually just totally bind to the fiber on their own. So if you're not wanting to do that extra step, you can use a plant and find one in the book that doesn't need a mordant. Many of them don't.
So you could actually, just with a pot and one of the plants that doesn't need a mordant, dye a t-shirt or some yarn.
Totally. And if you cook your plant in a copper pot, that's another way to do it. If you have copper, the copper will leach. And I did effluent tests with a biomimetic chemist, and the leach water, so everything I tested against how an amphibian would do if it was living in my water. And basically you can dilute any of these mordant baths over and over and over again and reuse them to the point where they're completely benign. But the copper, cooking things in a copper pot is super benign. And the copper, you could just cook your toy on in a copper pot, and that's the mordant. The copper leaching into there, that's your metal ion. So you can actually use your pot that you're cooking in as a mordant.
It's so cool. So really, you don't need a lot of equipment to get started.
Nope. I would recommend people start with one of those canning pots, like from the hardware store. They're very inexpensive. They're enamel. And so that means they're inert and they don't react. So if you're doing if you want clarity in your colors and you are going to use alum and you're going to, because alum creates very pure, true colors if you mordant with alum. You could buy a couple of enamel pots, dedicate them for dyeing. You can pick them up at garage sales too. I found tons of pots. All my copper pots are from garage sales. And some tongs are good, or a slotted spoon, because things get kind of hot and you want to be able to pull them easily out of the pot. I don't wear gloves, never have. Some people really like to wear gloves. I don't.
What color are your hands?
Well, today, because I'm not working with indigo, they're actually fairly clean. But when I work with indigo, I'm blue.
I've seen indigo dyed blankets, and what a color, gorgeous.
The blue is incredible.
And that brought me one of my questions, and you just answered it, are the byproducts of natural dyeing versus chemical dyeing. And so it's really two different things. And then you can compost the plant when you're done.
Yep. And it cooks out. So I use a lot of invasive plants. The other ethic of harvesting is, use plants that people want to get rid of or go in someone's yard waste and use a plant. But if you cook an invasive plant, a lot of the national park and state parks that I work with, they're saying, we don't want you to take the plants off site. If we're out cleaning up a land use area of distaff, this really crazy thistle plant, then we don't want you to take the plants off site because they might reseed in other areas. And so I sometimes bring my cooking pot on site to some of these places, and I bring a little rocket stove and I cook the plants on site, especially the invasive plants. And a lot of people call invasive plants that have homogenized a landscape. And I'll take them and I'll cook them. And then they become totally like benign. You can compost the invasive plant because you've cooked all the seed.
It's a great way to get rid, because I have known people that actually have to take, they call noxious weed seeds to the landfill.
Yes. So make dye.
So Rebecca, do you envision soon dyeing farms, maybe especially in your area at least, dyeing farms and color farms and mills, local mills popping up?
Oh, it's so nice. Music to my ears. Yes. To hear you say that, because I completely envision a future of these solar powered mills, mini mills that process our organic fibers. And we start hopefully getting to grow fibers that I'm really in love with, like linen, which is a flax fiber. And I hope we can start growing hemp, which is the most amazing plant I think mankind has ever interacted with, because of its amazing uses for nutrition and fiber out of one plant. So industrial hemp, linen, I see all those bast fibers being grown, and nettles. I look forward to harvesting nettle fiber and processing that in these solar powered mini mills. And then once those fibers are milled and made into yarns, then we can go and dye them in our homegrown indigo. So these dye farms will have, for my dye farm currently, Japanese indigo, which will create blues on all these local organic raw fibers, and Rubia tinctorium, which is madder root. So we'll have red, Coreopsis for bright, bright oranges and yellows, actually more stunning oranges than yellow. And then all the native plants I see as a hedgerow for all of our agricultural processes. So all of my dye plants, I have to farm very few dye plants. So when I say dye farm, I think there are areas of cultivation that do need human irrigation systems, human designed irrigation systems, but the rest of the dye plants, and that's why the book is so designed the way it is around native and naturalized species, is that most of the color is actually going to come from plants that don't need any serious agricultural cultivation. They actually only need to be tended. And I call it Tending the Wild, which is the name of a book that inspired my entire process. So hopefully we will be maximizing our agricultural lands just for the plants we ultimately need, which I could see being the organic non-GMO cottons, linen, which comes from flax, and hemp. We could pasture graze all of our sheep through the fields, especially if we're strategically rotating the sheep through areas where the cotton is done growing, areas where the hemp is done growing, and then out into the wildlands to consistently just keep the grasses, the perennial bunch grasses mowed. I see a kind of an integrated system between protein fibers, cellulose fibers, wildlands, native plants, and agriculturally produced color. And I think it could all be done on, a 10-acre site. You could have an incredible module for this on less than 10 acres, actually. So I look forward to that.
What a wonderful vision, a great vision for the future. And the benefits would be better health for all of us. Instead of wearing plastic, which many of us do, we could be wearing local plants and local dyes from our fiber shed.
Oh, I think it's extremely possible. And like I said, I'm becoming increasingly more optimistic about the process.
Now, if someone wants to find more about you and order your book, what's the best place to find you online?
Well, if you're primarily interested in the work of natural dyes, then I would go to RebeccaRBurgess.com, and it's RebeccaRBurgess.com. You do get somewhere else if you don't type in the R in the middle. And then if you're interested in Fiber Shed and the work that the community is doing to clothe itself, that's www.fibershed.com. And on that homepage where you go for Fiber Shed, there's all the stories of the farmers and artisans. Right there, you can click on a little box and read about whomever you want to. And then on the top right-hand corner, you can click on our marketplace, and you can see what all those people that you're reading about, what they're doing and what they're making and what they're offering. So that's pretty much how our web platform works currently.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for your time today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. For more information or to hear our other podcasts or interviews, visit www.sustainableworldradio.com. Sustainable World Radio is produced by Jill Cloutier. Music by Dana Lyons. Thanks for listening.